Hey guys, this is Frank Gogol, writer of Dead End Kids and No Heroin. You recently heard me on the show to talk about my new book, Dead End Kids, The Suburban Job. Dead End Kids, The Suburban Job follows three former friends who have all been deeply affected by the events of September 11th as they struggle alone to cope with the long-term effects of that tragic day and what happens to them when they find a bag of cash stolen from a local drug kingpin. I just wanted to drop by and remind you guys that Dead End Kids, The Suburban Job is currently up for pre-order. For those of you who haven't checked out the original Dead End Kids, The Suburban Job is a fresh start, a new cast and a new place with a new crime. For those of you who love the original series, we've got the entire creative team back together again to bring you more of what you loved the first time around. But whether you're a new or returning reader, I think you'll really dig the new series. If you want to check out Dead End Kids, The Suburban Job, be sure to get your pre-orders in at your local comic shop by December 4th.
Hey everyone, my name's Bret Juliano. I'm the creator of Dust Bunny Mafia, and you're watching Two Geeks Talking.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Two Geeks Talking is an entertainment industry interview show where we interview the creative people from the comic, film, TV, movie, and video game industries. And of course, I'm your host, Kurt Sasso. We are joined today by a comic creator. I recently met him on the GabFest 20 almost weekly community Twitter events that are being held by Mark Stokes, which is great, where he brings together creators that happen to be on during the times of the conventions, mini conventions, I should say. And it's a great way to reach out to people. So Mark, thanks for keep on doing that, and thanks for introducing me to our newest guest on Two Geeks Talking. He is, of course, the creator of Dust Bunny Mafia, which I love the title, by the way. We are joined today by, of course, Bret Juliano. How are you doing today, Bret?
Good. How are you?
Doing good. I love comics like this because this is something where it takes my Italian heritage, puts it into cartoony form, and, you don't have to pay for cement every week. So it's a great thing to see.
Yes, it's definitely a lot more cost efficient this way.
Tell us about how Dust Bunny Mafia got started and what it's all about.
So, Dust Bunny Mafia is like Looney Tunes meets The Godfather. So, being part Italian, I always, my immediate family was small, but when I could meet with my extended Italian side, we always had these big, loud gatherings, the type that's, normally depicted in movies and TV and such. And being so far away from them on a daily basis, it was just nice to have that experience of being with the big, large family. And I missed that, because we didn't live around them and only saw them during holidays and such. And so, I grew up doodling on everything, watching Saturday morning cartoons, trying to sketch the characters. In school, a lot of my notes and tests and everything, if I would finish early, you'd have little doodles on them. And I'd always been drawing. I was reading the funny papers every weekend, mornings before school if I could, if I had time. And so I always wanted to do something in the animation or the comic industry. But, things don't always work according to your dreams as a kid. And so as I grew up, I kind of drifted away from that, but still had that interest. And so when I was in college, I was just finishing up my degree, and I was working in a technical job. And I happened to be driving home from work on a Friday night, stuck in LA traffic, and I saw DBM on a license plate. And I was, I had 2 hours to go, and I'm like, what could DBM stand for? I've got nothing to do. I'm sitting here. So I was racking my brain trying to think of, different acronyms. And then I thought Dust Bunny Mafia. And I'm like, that's it. That's the comic that I wanted to do. And I, grabbed a piece of paper, scribbled out a small character, and then by the time I got home, I had the first 6 characters of my Dust Bunny family like envisioned in my head. And I had the tools to create a comic. I had all the software involved. I was a web designer, and so I knew how to build a website. And I was like, well, I'm just going to start going for it. And now we are 8 years later.
And here you are. It's great. I mean, yeah, inspiration from a license plate. That's awesome. I love that. I mean, you get those personalized license plates like Godzilla or golfing for one or whatever the thing is.
Yep.
But to create something so simple and so effective with Dust Bunny Mafia, I think that's amazing. 8 years though is a great amount of time to put into this type of comic though. What were some of your Italian inspirations besides the family, so to speak, that got you on this comic?
I mean, well, one of the things that always interested me was like the secret societies. And I mean, it wasn't Italian at first that got me interested. I remember doing a report in middle school about the about World War II and Nazi Germany and such. And I was reading something on the Diary of Anne Frank, and with that I did a report on the Gestapo, which were the secret police and in Germany. And that always fascinated me, that like secret society kind of thing. And then as I continued to grow up, I always was fascinated with like the criminal side of things. So like most of the people, when you're watching TV shows, like my wife and I like the procedural, Law and Order, Criminal Minds type of thing.
Yeah.
And my wife would always be very interested in how are the police going to get there in time? And I was like, how did they just miss the police in this one instance? And so the criminal side fascinated me more on those type of things. And so I've always had an avid interest in the criminal side of things. And I'm like, what if I took, something cute like Looney Tunes style, but was able to do a criminal aspect to it that also made it kind of this dichotomy of they're a mobster family, so they're kind of ruthless, but yet what if I put a cute aspect as something that you wouldn't expect?
Talk about some of your characters. The first character that you created, that you kind of did a quick sketch on. Let's talk about the entire family, starting with the main character.
Okay. The first character that I drew was Jimmy the Nose, who's this little guy. And he's basically the informant / like consigliere character of a modern mafia family. So he's the like second to the boss, in which he's like the trusted advisor. And that was how I saw myself. In like, I was very good with information, and if I was ever to be in that situation in a family structure, I wouldn't see myself as leading the family. It'd be more of like, I don't want the spotlight, but let me handle all the details. I got this covered. Leading the family is Leo.
Yep.
Leo is down here with the meat cleaver. So he's kind of your typical Joe Pesci, angry little Italian character. Very bold and wants the headlines, but yet is still good about keeping the family in order. Swift justice kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Then we've got Vic, who's the hitman, the sharpshooter. He never takes off those glasses, so you hardly ever actually see, his face per se. Then we've got Vinny the Mouth, who's the lawyer, the mouthpiece of the mob. He's going to be out in front when the characters are, needing legal assistance or publicity per se. On the other side, you've got Leadfoot Lucy. She's the driver and the only female member of the Dust Bunny crew. You've got Kenny the Crypt, who's the computer hacker, because bringing it into a modern day setting.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're going to do crime nowadays, you've got identity theft, you've got, credit card fraud, you've got hacking.
Yeah.
Those would bring it into the modern era. You've got Benny the Bookie, who in this book is kind of like where he starts out and where the story really jumps off, in where he's just being introduced, where the previous accountant for the Dust Bunny family got fired because he was stealing secrets and giving them to rivals. And so all of a sudden, Jimmy gets tasked with finding someone new to replace the old guy. And he goes, well, my friend basically doesn't know anything other than, QuickBooks, but does that work? And they're like, you're in.
That's awesome.
We've got Sal, who's the big mechanic who breaks more things than he fixes. And then lastly, we've got Frankie the Force, who's kind of the muscle.
Nice.
And I pictured him as like the old Everybody Loves Raymond, like the big brother Robert, who's not very smart, but he knows that he's got, power in his girth.
Oh, that's awesome. And they look like fun characters to write with as well too. I mean, that was book 1, right?
Yes.
And you have how many books out?
I have 2 full books like this. Meet the Family, which came out in 2016, and then The Blind Tiger, which is I just actually came out with it this year in April. And so it's my second full-length comic collection. They're kind of the size that you would expect from the old Calvin and Hobbes, Garfield, collections. So that's the 2 full-length collections that I have right now. And I've got a couple of smaller booklets, zine-style ones called Based on a True Story. Volume 1.
Oh, awesome.
And Volume 2 was just... I just finished kickstarting this one, actually, a couple weeks ago.
That's what I threw into your lower third there as well, too. It looks like a beautiful... I love the cover design, and I love the action that you have with your characters as well. There's a lot of history when it comes to the mafioso and everything like that. I mean, from what was actually reported in the news to what was never reported in the news, and probably rightly so, things that we probably shouldn't know about as well. Are you taking kind of hints from those types of tales for your comic, or are you just you have the concept of the family and you based on what you know, you're writing your own tales for that?
I do a little bit of both. With my normal comic, a lot of what's been published up until the past couple of years was strictly like my interest in, mob movies, everything from The Godfather to Goodfellas and like The Departed, and then just different things I'd see in the media and playing with the idea of multiple crime families, trying to take each other out and, simultaneously abate the cops. So some of that for my normal strip is, purely fictional with hints of real life thrown in. And then more recently, with my Based on a True Story series, about 4 years ago, I moved to Chicago. And coming to Chicago, one of the first things I did was I'm about 15 minutes away from the gravesite of Al Capone and a number of, the big name Chicago mobsters.
Nice.
And so I gave myself I went on Google Maps, I plotted a route, and I kind of gave myself, a mobster tour of the grave sites of that area. And so coming here was a big okay, this is actually a town that really had the mob influence, and there's still stuff standing, like houses that people owned are still there. Not everything, of course, because some of this was 100 years ago, but there are still a decent amount of history in this town that can be directly tied back to these mobsters. And I'm like, what how can I incorporate this real life history with my comics? And I got the idea for the based on a true story. And so I started out with doing a section called Mobimals, which are real life mobsters that have animal nicknames. And so I would illustrate their cartoon counterparts. And then it just kind of branched off from there. And so like with my based on a true story fully, these volumes are specifically, I take a chunk of mobster trivia, something that I find really interesting, and then I'll adapt it using my Dust Bunny characters. So like those strips that are running underneath on this are from some of the, that's part of the based on true story.
Nice. It's funny you mentioned Al Capone because from where I'm from, Windsor, Ontario, we have and obviously Highram Walkers is one of our main brewing companies that is still located here. And recently there was a restaurant that was torn down, and when they tore it down, it was called A-Bars. And when they tore it down, they found hidden tunnels underneath that spanned all the way to Detroit that they had to fill in, unfortunately. But they could only go so far because half the tunnels were either collapsed or water from the Detroit River had already come in type situation. So the stories of Al Capone meeting in the basement of Highram Walkers, and there's like you can still do a tour of the place, and you can see bullet holes that have been shot into it, and so that history, that connection with the Canadian Prohibition era, or during the Prohibition era, I should say, is rather interesting. So if you happen to do anything from Canada, that'd be awesome too. So just saying.
That would be. I'll have to look into that more. I've heard about the tunnels, and being in Chicago, I've working out in some of the different Chicago area. I've done some stuff in Wisconsin that I know Capone had, all sorts of shipping and bootlegging enterprises where they would use Lake Michigan to try and get boats smuggling rum and different things to just little landmarks that I'm like, oh. In fact, the other couple of weeks ago, my wife and I were eating in this place, and apparently it was one of it was a barn that Al Capone had on this property in, the 60 miles from downtown Chicago, where he used it for just hideaway and kind of things. And they took this house that was on this property and relocated it, and now it's a restaurant, and it's been there for 60 years. But at the time, Al Capone may have been in that house, and it was just and that was just random. I didn't even know about that before, but some of the bar patrons were talking about that. I'm like, oh, interesting.
Nice. Another thing that is during the Prohibition era, at least in our area, the Detroit River is known to freeze over. And so Lake St. Clair, which is one of the smaller connecting lakes, obviously, of the Great Lake chain, freezes over constantly. It was used to transport rum and other things by car across the way.
Oh, yeah.
And so there have been cases where, because the river isn't too deep, but it's very fast moving, they've had divers dive down. Not only were there ships from the War of 1812, but there was also Model Ts still full of bottles of rum and all that stuff that sank because it crashed through the ice. So it's incredible, the history of the ingenuity of the mafia to get the product where it's needed and to make money as they did. So I'm glad that you're doing a wonderful take on it as well too.
Thank you. Yeah, I've always found it interesting. I mean, I've always been an avid reader, and I've got probably 30, 40 or so true crime books in my collection so far. And that's one of the things when I moved to Chicago, and I was like, how can I take some of the real life stories, especially in Chicago, and bring them to people, to kind of tie in, they say truth is stranger than fiction. And I was like, all right, I'm going to take these real stories, kind of give a bit to it, and then put my take on it. So like with the based on a true story, each one has, a comic where I'll do my take on it, and obviously it's fictional, but then I give a little bit of a detailed account, to get people to know how the actual truth, what the actual truth behind it was.
Definitely. I think it's great. It's a great way to showcase a history that is sometimes over glorified, but to show that it's still a part of Americana and history in general. Like, it's wonderful to see that these real life people, as bad as they were, if they were all bad, I don't, maybe the mafia just wanted to make money and they just don't want to pay taxes. I mean, that's not really a bad thing. People do it all the time. Apparently it's called tax evasion. So it is what it is. But you're taking history and you're giving it a wonderful spin, and it's educational, and it's well drawn, and it looks well written as well too, from what I've gotten to read. But you mentioned movies as well, and crime movies are always the guilty pleasure of many. Godfather obviously is a true classic. Godfather 2 as well. 3 not so much. 3 doesn't exist.
Surprisingly, they're actually re-editing part 3, and it's supposed to come out in the next month or so.
Yeah, I've heard that.
I'm holding my breath on that one.
Yeah. I thought they're calling it the death of Corleone or something like that.
Yep.
I don't know how much they can truly edit it properly, because it just wasn't really well done, plain and simple. It was just too heavy-handed, and really didn't focus in on the family itself, or at least the demise of the family, if they were going that route. It just felt like, okay, here's the next chapter, and away you go.
Yeah, and I really felt like even, there was a discrepancy, a whole degree of the acting and the emotion, and it just wasn't well done. And I don't know how much you can edit bad acting.
Yeah, you can't polish a turd, basically. Play it simple. Sofia Coppola, at least at that time, she's done other good films as a director, but I think that was her first entrance into being a director for a major franchise. And yes, her father did the first 2, but she just didn't quite have the same take as he did with a carefully developed story. But her other stuff has been really well done, I think. I think she's a wonderful director. It's just that I wouldn't have used that as your entry into Hollywood.
Yeah, that seems like a big
undertaking.
Big shoes to fill, taking on your father's legacy and then
pouring gasoline on it and lighting it on fire.
Pretty much. Okay.
So I have to ask this because, being Italian as we are, I'm half Italian, basically. I'm Italian-Hungarian. But my Italian side of my family is Sicilian and Calabrese. So 2 of the most crazy portions of Italian culture there is. How about yourself? What's your family or family branch?
From what I remember, I know we had Sicilian and we had up near Tuscany. But then before that, it was Calabrese as well. Nice. And so I actually, a couple of years ago, attended a comic convention in the Twin Cities area, and there's another fellow cartoonist that has Juliano spelled the same way, and I was like, hey, are we tangentially related somehow? And so I tried to get one of my aunts, who's the real historian in our family, to try and get her on the phone to be like, do we have any relatives in the Minnesota area. And she's like, we might, but Giuliano is actually a pretty common Italian name. And I'm like, so we're like the Smiths? And she's like, not quite that far, but enough that it's, there's enough of us out there. And I'm like, so how far back can we go? She's like, well, Calabrese. And I'm like, and so when I brought it up to Phil, this other creator, he's like, everybody's from Calabrese. It's like, okay.
It's same with Sasso. It's it's like Smith, realistically, in this general area because of whatever. In fact, there's like 4 branches of the family that have gone into different industries between lawyers, teachers, garbage disposal.
I was gonna say those first 2 are pretty common for Italians.
Yeah.
To be.
Garbage disposal, not so much.
Not in the legitimate side.
Right. Legitimate side, yeah. What are your top 5 guilty pleasure films that you can always watch besides Godfather when it comes to the mafioso genre?
That's a good one. I'd say The Departed is up there. I thought that was, a nice fresh take. Still going with the organized crime, but it's less because it's more based on Whitey Bulger in the Boston area. One that's under the radar would be Lucky Number 11, which is a very indie movie, but very much had the organized crime aspect, and that's actually one of the big influences for my comic.
Nice.
I really liked the, offbeat, the wordplay, and it has kind of an offbeat storytelling, just with the camera angles and the music and everything. Really flew under the radar, I feel.
The pacing and the acting were really well done too. I mean, you have a jaded Bruce Willis that still does what he does since the 80s, but at least it was more entertaining this time around.
Yes. And I mean, you've got a star-studded cast outside of that. I mean, you've got Morgan Freeman, Ben Kingsley, Lucy Liu, Josh Hartnett. Those are all top name, top billed actors and actresses. And yet a lot of people I'll talk to will be like, what's one of your favorite, Mafia films? And I'll say that, and they're like, what was that? Other than those, I would probably say Goodfellas.
Yep.
And I will put Goodfellas above Casino any day.
Wow.
Because I feel like despite the research I've done into the Vegas mob, I don't think Casino lacked the plot, I feel like, of Goodfellas. And those two, constantly get compared because of the cast and, Joe Pesci essentially playing the same character.
Since the 50s, yeah.
Yeah. Not typical of the industry, but I would say My Cousin Vinny.
Yeah.
Would be another favorite of mine. Just, growing up and seeing that, on TV whenever my parents would, find it on, and all of a sudden everything stopped, and that was, picked hands down whenever it was playing. And it's a nice comedy in that genre.
Last one. It's tough, I know.
Yeah. So this is less organized crime, but it's more of a heist movie, but I would have to go with the Ocean's 11.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there are aspects a little bit in the background with Andy Garcia's character kind of shows a little bit of a crime background to managing the casinos and such. And I mean, Vegas is known for, being built by the mob. So there's always that tie to it. So I'd probably have to go with that. That's kind of a jet off of. It doesn't have as much of a mobster feel to it, but it's definitely this crime heist movie.
Yeah, for sure. And it's another star-studded cast of of amazing actors, like Oscar-worthy actors, of course, too. And the other two films that followed it were actually pretty well done as well. I still think they couldn't have topped Ocean's 11, but they did pretty good for 12 and 13. 12, I think, was a little better than 13, but that's just me. Oh, that's great. I mean, obviously, all great films, truly. And it's difficult when it comes to this because you can only take so much creative license with the Mafia, because you're now dealing with unions. So, about the same.
Yes, I mean, and I've actually recently, last year when it came out, there was a lot of big hype over The Irishman.
Yeah.
And I had my expectations pretty high because I'd heard about it in like the different Mafia Facebook groups and different things for a couple of years by the time that it came out. And I saw it, was dedicated myself to watching it all in one sitting, and like the typical movie theater, even though, by that point I was at home and it didn't matter. And yet I think they could have done better with it.
Why is that?
I find the story of Frank Sheeran and Jimmy Hoffa really interesting. I've also come to realize that there's a lot of fiction in Frank's story, and so and not that fiction can't make good movies. That's obviously not the case, but there were certain things where I would have rather seen them not motion cap or de-age some of the characters, and would have rather had younger people in some of that were made to look like Frank in different eras. So there are certain things that an 80-year-old can't do, despite like actions getting up. I mean, I don't remember exactly how old Pacino is, but I know
70s, I think.
Yeah, and so when he's trying to play, a 40-year-old, and I read some of the behind the scenes stuff where they worked with different people to kind of like different acting coaches to say, all right, you need to do this shot again because this is not how a 40-year-old would get up out of the chair behind the desk, and different things. And there are just some things where it's like not as believable for me, and I would have rather seen them do something like in Boardwalk Empire, where they took different actors and cast them for different parts of the life, and then showed, Joe Pesci and Pacino and the different ones at the, if they're in their mid 50s to their 80s, that's fine. Like there's a certain age range where I think they could still play, but they didn't need to have them all the way, playing their 50 years ago version of themselves.
I think it's interesting and it's difficult to do. I mean, I think The Crown was the only show recently that I've seen that they've done it properly, where they literally are casting younger versions of the Queen and the other characters, I should say, of the royal family, and it's believable. It's at least a nice even transition from, even though every season is like 2 years worth of acting, so they're not overusing who they have. But yeah, you have amazing actors like Al Pacino, Joe Pesci, De Niro, and you have the ever talented Scorsese directing. I mean, that's truly like a hallmark for just talent, plain and simple. Like if there's anything that's quintessential Scorsese, it's those four actors. But yeah, right. I did watch The Irishman. I just felt it also dragged too. The pacing wasn't consistent across the board, unfortunately. It was enjoyable to a certain extent, but you're right. Some scenes you got taken away out of their acting. Another example actually is if you watched Captain Captain Marvel. Samuel L. Jackson is a de-aged person in that film as well. In the archive section towards the second half of the film, watch him running. He doesn't run like a young person at all, and it's actually kind of hilarious to a certain extent.
That's actually the other part was, I believe it was De Niro when he was beating someone up in The Irishman, when his daughter was thrown out of the store for, and he comes back and is trying to beat the store owner. He's trying to kick them, and I was like, that did not look believable. But
kick this pillow, De Niro. I can't. My damn hip is just not doing it. Give me a hot pack and
I'll see you in 20 minutes.
Yeah. Going back to your comic though, unfortunately conventions aren't a thing currently, but when you do table at conventions, what's the common response when it comes to a person either young or old kind of picking it up and flipping through what you've done?
The common response, I say, when people notice it and actually get the humor, because like my business card, which I don't have on me, is actually I took a MasterCard logo and I turned it into my business card, and instead I put Mobster Card on it, and the red circle is actually like a splash of blood. And that's one of the first things I'll hand people. I'll hand people like a bookmark that has one of my quick punchlines to it, or they'll ask for a business card and I'll hand them that, and if they connect with that humor, it's like instantaneous. Oh, this is good. This isn't what I was expecting. One of the nice things about my comics that's different is, even though I'm using the term mobster and mafia and these things, it's an all ages comic. So my niece, who's 8, can read my comics and not have to her parents don't have to worry about there's suggestive language or there's going to be a lot of bloodshed and stuff, because they're cartoon characters. It's not going to be, she's probably seen worse on daytime television than what's actually happening in my comics. There's certainly worse language, and so I'll get a lot of parents and librarians and such actually will come up and ask, can I give this to my 5-year-old, 8-year-old, 10-year-old, etc. It's like, yes, there's worse things on TV. If kids are watching The Walking Dead and stuff, that's going to be more gruesome than my comics.
The occasional red blood splatter is nothing compared to what you see on TV these days. It's pretty crazy. Is humor a good benefit as a creative writer for yourself? Does it help you become expressive with your characters?
Yeah, I feel like, especially with being the both the writer and the artist of my comic, one of the things that, and especially with the fact that my characters, don't have the full face, they have eyes, and that's about it. And so I tried to give that constraint on myself. Considering that they are dust bunnies, I tried to, put a bit of realism in that, if dust bunnies were real, they probably wouldn't have, arms and everything. But so with me being able to limit myself in their design, the using humor is a nice way for me to kind of take just take a different spin and get people out of the kind of out of their day. And so I can provide people with a break, whether it's, 30 seconds to read one comic or, 5 minutes if they're reading one of my booklets. Just something that helps them, especially with all that's going around nowadays, with the pandemic and different things. People need breaks from reality. I mean, that's why things like Disney Plus and Netflix are huge and right now. So
I think this is a great comic. I love what you're doing. I want to see you keep doing this, and I'd love to have you back on when you're doing like your next book, or if you have something coming up, maybe a new chapter or something creative else that you're doing. So it's an open. You got an open invitation to come on the show. Please do.
Well, thank you. This was great. I'd love to come back.
Everyone has one or two people that kind of inspired them on their path to where they are today. Who was that for you?
So the two people for me would actually be a couple of fellow cartoonists. One is John Esparza of the Bubble Fox comics, and Josh Hawk, who does the Tales of the Brothers 3. Mm-hmm. These cartoonists I actually met at a Long Beach Comic-Con in 2015, I believe it was, where I'd been, making the Dust Bunny Mafia for 3 years at that point. I had probably 300 or 400 strips done, because at that point I was doing them 2 to 3 times a week, and I was just publishing them online, posting on social media and such, but I wasn't doing anything in terms of like creating a book. I had no physical merchandise for the comics at that point. And I was going to one of the local conventions, and I sat and I was talking with them, and as I was there, they're like, "Oh, you do comics." And so like I was reading their stuff, they were asking about mine. I pulled up, the tablet so that they could read some of my stuff online and different things. And they encouraged me so much to like, and kind of validated me as an indie artist, to be asking, they're like, you've got this kind of thing, what's your process? And we would go back, and, the fact that they took time to not try and sell me on their merchandise and saw my value as a creator trying to, in the independent scene, was just very refreshing, especially because, I was at a convention. I was taking time away from potential people to stop by their table and actually make transactions to help, offset costs and everything. That at one point Josh was like, "Hey, you know what? This is really good. I still want to talk with you. Why don't you come around back?" And he invited me behind the table so we could continue talking, but yet free up, the table to allow for people to come through and, still. And that was just a big thing for me, that I actually gave them a big shout out and dedication in my first book, Meet the Family, because they were so inspirational to being like, you've got the tools, you've definitely got the amount of comics that you need to put a book together, just do it. What's stopping you?
From a professional standpoint, you've created multiple books. You are creating your comic on a daily basis. You are doing wonderful in that regard from a professional standpoint, and you're passionately enjoying what you're doing, which is wonderful. Do you consider yourself personally successful?
Yes, I would. I feel that I've achieved what I wanted with my Dust Bunny Mafia comics. I mean, one of the first things that actually kind of gave me that value, or that kind of feeling of being successful with the comics, was when I first got my Meet the Family proof in my hand and actually put it on Amazon and sold a couple units when I attended one of the first conventions, and actually had a book there that people that didn't know me, didn't follow me, and ended up buying. And that was, one of the first real tangible ways that I felt successful with this book. and with my comics. And this is a hobby of mine. It's definitely not my way to make a living, but just the fact that I can get my art and writing out there and for people to um, be able to enjoy it, and is truly a measure of success that um, inspires me to do better and to try and expand.
The reverse of success is failure. How do you deal with your failures?
The biggest failure for me, or I should say the biggest critic um, for failure for me, is myself. Um, and so being at conventions, it's a hard thing when there's not a lot of people buying. It's a lot, and it's very easy to focus on those type of things. Or, for instance, I had my first attempt at a Kickstarter for The Blind Tiger wasn't successful because I put a goal that was too high. Um, and I think the biggest thing when it comes to dealing with failure is to, give yourself a break. So, like when it came to my Blind Tiger, as soon as I knew that I wasn't going to make the goal, I started planning what could I change? What could I do differently? And one of the biggest successes for that is when you can take your failure and transfer it or change it to not focus on that and kind of step outside of just the emotional aspect. So I was able to take a step back from the campaign, realize I set the project goal to be way too high for my audience at the time, and I had a $5,000 goal, which I then took a step back, let it run its course, finished the campaign, and then took a matter of, I think it was 3 weeks before I relaunched a campaign with about half the goal, and hit it. And so one of the big things is just being able to kind of take a step back, analyze, and kind of remove yourself from the failure, because you are not, you are not the failure if you keep going.
The younger generation are looking at your work as they have at comic conventions and as you have when you're promoting it on Twitter and as you promote yourself. And they're becoming inspired to be creative in their own right, either becoming an artist or a writer or whatever they choose to become. How can they inspire the generation that follows them?
I think one of the biggest things they can do to inspire the people coming after them is to continually push themselves, to learn, to grow in their artistic endeavors, in their professional endeavors. One of the most rewarding things for me when I'm laying out a book, for instance, is looking at how my art progressed and my writing has progressed over the years. So when I first started laying out my Blind Tiger collection last year, I was looking back at strips that I had done in 2015, and this was 2019. So there's 5 years worth of growth that I had done that was, partially encompassed in this book. And it took a lot of effort to say, this is where I was, and I'm not going to invalidate that and kind of redo or rework a bunch of the old material to try and get up to the standard of what the end of the book looked like. And I think that people like the ability to see growth in that aspect. And so go out there and, push yourself. If you want to be a writer, start writing. If you want to do comics, start drawing, start putting together a strip. There's nothing stopping you, especially nowadays with the tools and stuff that's freely available, that you can't, start pursuing whatever avenue that inspires you. I look back at my, first comics, and there's, 100 things that I would change now if I were to redo Dust Bunny Mafia from the beginning. But then I wouldn't know that if I wasn't continually pushing myself and trying to just get it out there. And it's not finished, but it's complete, and therefore push it.
Do you find that because society today is based on instant gratification, that if they fail, that they just stop?
I mean, I know there are definitely some aspects of that, and but I mean, I kind of started out that way, in the aspect of I was looking for immediate gratification when I was first publishing the Dust Bunny Mafia. I was posting it on, my website, and I could track a little bit of the analytics of who was coming, but I didn't really know who was coming. I knew that, this particular strip, when I posted it, got 10 visits or 20 visits or such. And then I would post it on Facebook and be like, okay, how many likes, how many shares, how many comments do I get when those factors, when I would see them. But nowadays, it's not about how many eyeballs on it necessarily. It's about getting the people that connect and finding kind of your tribe of other creators and people that support you. So it's not about a numbers game. It's more about making valuable connections.
Like I said, Bret, unfortunately, that ends this particular episode of Two Geeks Talking. I do want to thank you for coming on the show, but before we let you go, where can we find you on social media and all of those other wonderful presences?
Yeah, so you can find, I'm on Facebook, facebook.com/Dust Bunny Mafia, or you can search Dust Bunny Mafia on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. I've also got, my website, comics.dustbunnymafia.com, and I have my store, which you can find all my collections and my based on a true story at shop.dustbunnymafia.com. And also, if someone on my main website, there's a Join the Mafia tab. And if you click that link and provide me with your email address, I'll send you a PDF of my Based on a True Story booklet absolutely free.
Before I let you go, is there anything else that I haven't talked about that you would like to share?
I will say that I've got another Kickstarter planned. So for those of you familiar with crowdfunding, my next project launching sometime in January is a set of Dust Bunny Mafia playing cards.
Hang on.
In which I take my Dust Bunny Mafia characters. So I mean, it's a standard poker-sized deck of playing cards, and I'm directly utilizing my comic characters. So 52 cards for my 52 characters who've appeared in the comics over the past 8 years, and that'll be coming sometime in January.
Oh, that looks awesome. I love the quality of the back. The reflective nature was really cool too.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, like I said, Bret, that ends this particular episode of Two Geeks Talking. I want to thank you again for coming on the show. You can find, of course, his work on the Lower Third comic, which will also be in the channel notes as well. You can find this interview and almost 1,000 others on tgtmedia.com or twogeekstalking.com. That's the word two, not the number two. You can find this interview, of course, on youtube.com/c/tgtmedia. And, of course, you can find me on social media at Kurt Sasso on pretty much everything from LinkedIn to Facebook to Twitter, etc., and Instagram as well. Thanks, everyone, for listening and watching. Tune in next week for another great interview on Two Geeks Talking, where everyone has a story to tell, and it's up to me to help bring that out.